Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. You've heard this before. It's become almost liturgical in its repetition, a mantra that defines the universe of Warhammer 40,000. But what does it truly mean when we talk about war that spans not just worlds, not just solar systems, but entire millennia? What happens to the warriors who fight in conflicts so ancient that entire civilizations rise and fall in the space between one battle and the next? Imagine for a moment the sheer weight of 5,000 years. 5,000 years ago in our own timeline, the Great Pyramids of Egypt were already ancient. Entire empires that we now know only through fragmentary records and archaeological digs were at their height. The very languages we speak today didn't exist. The cities we call old were not even conceived. And yet, in the galaxy of the 41st millennium, 5,000 years is but a heartbeat, a single breath in the endless cycle of violence that defines existence. Across countless worlds, scattered like forgotten seeds across the stellar void, there lie battlefields where wars were fought so long ago that even the reasons for conflict have been lost to time. Trenches dug by soldiers whose names are no longer recorded. Fortifications built by engineers whose techniques have been forgotten. War machines left to rust and decay, their purposes unclear to those who might stumble across them millennia later. These forgotten war zones tell silent stories of sacrifice and slaughter, of victory and defeat, all rendered meaningless by the crushing weight of deep time. On these ancient battlefields, sometimes something waits, not dead, not truly alive, but suspended in that terrible space between the two. A warrior who fought when the galaxy was younger, a hero entombed in metal and ceramite, sealed away in darkness, dreaming dreams that might be memories or might be something else entirely. And sometimes, just sometimes, the galaxy has a dark sense of humor. Sometimes, those who find these ancient sleepers are the last beings in the universe you'd want disturbing such a rest. Today, we're going to explore one such encounter, a collision between the ancient and the anarchic, a meeting between imperial reverence and orcish ingenuity. This is the story of what happens when orcs find a dreadnought that's been sleeping for 5,000 years. And to understand why this meeting is so significant, so darkly comedic, and so perfectly emblematic of the universe in which it takes place, we need to understand both parties in this unlikely encounter. The forgotten battlefield. The world had no name anymore. Oh, it had once, certainly. 5,000 years ago, it had been marked on imperial star charts as Vandius Tertius, the third planet in the Vandius system, located in a sector whose very designation has since been reassigned 3 times over. It had been a thriving agri-world then, its vast fields producing grain for a dozen nearby systems, its population numbering in the hundreds of millions. But that was before the war came. The conflict that consumed Vandius Tertius began, as so many wars do in the Imperium, over a matter that seemed trivial to those not involved. A dispute over tithes, accusations of heresy leveled by an overzealous cardinal against the planetary governor, political maneuvering in the sector command that went catastrophically wrong. The exact details don't matter anymore because they're lost, buried beneath 5 millennia of subsequent conflicts, forgotten in archives that were themselves destroyed in wars that followed. What matters is that the world became a battlefield. The Imperial Guard arrived in their millions. The Space Marines came, a full company of the Crimson Castellans chapter, their red and silver armor gleaming with purpose as they made planetfall. They came to bring order, to restore Imperial authority, to purge whatever taint or rebellion had taken root, but they found resistance. Whether it was genuine heresy, desperate self-defense, or simply the fog of war turning allies into enemies, is now impossible to say. The Crimson Castellans fought. They fought hard. The agricultural fields that had once fed billions became killing grounds. Trenches were dug through soil that had known only plowshares, now torn by artillery and the treads of tanks. The great silos that had stored grain for transport off-world were converted into fortifications, their walls reinforced with plasteel and ceramite. The gentle rolling hills where farmers had once worked became strategic positions to be captured and recaptured at horrific cost. For 7 years, the war raged. 7 years of grinding, brutal warfare that saw the deployment of weapons that should never have been used on a populated world. Virus bombs that left entire continents as sterile wastelands. Orbital strikes that cracked the planet's crust and sent megatons of debris into the atmosphere. Bioweapons that twisted the remaining population into things that were no longer quite human. By the time the conflict finally sputtered to an exhausted conclusion, Vandius Tertius was dead in every way that mattered. The Crimson Castellans had won, technically. They held the field. They had cleansed the heresy, real or imagined. But the cost had been catastrophic. Of the 100 space marines who had begun the campaign, fewer than 20 remained. Their casualties had been devastating, losses that would take the chapter decades to recover from. Among the fallen was Brother Captain Thalric, a veteran of 3 centuries of warfare, a warrior whose tactical genius had won victories on a dozen different worlds. When a traitor artillery shell found him, it should have been the end. But the apothecaries reached him in time, barely. His body was shattered beyond the ability of even space marine physiology to repair, but his mind, his experience, his warrior's spirit, these could be preserved. The decision was made in the field, amid the smoke and chaos of battle. Thalric would be interred in a dreadnought. The chapter's tech marines worked through the night, preparing the ancient war machine that had been brought from their battle barge specifically for this purpose. The process was as much ritual as surgery, prayers and unguents applied alongside neural interfaces and life support systems. When dawn broke over the ruined battlefield, Brother Captain Thalric was no more. In his place stood ancient Thalric, encased in the adamantium shell of a Castroferum pattern dreadnought, armed with an assault cannon and power fist that made his previous weapons look like toys. He fought for another 6 months after his interment. He led charges that broke enemy lines. He held positions that should have been overrun. He became a legend among the remaining guard regiments, the walking embodiment of the Emperor's wrath. But when the war finally ended, when the last enemy fell and the smoke cleared to reveal a world scoured clean of life, there was a problem. The Vox arrays had been destroyed in the fighting. The astropathic choir was dead. The chapter's fleet was gone, pulled away to another crisis in another system, unaware that the fighting on Vandius Tertius had concluded. The survivors were stranded. 20 space marines, a few hundred guardsmen, and ancient Thalric, standing among the ruins of a world that could no longer support life. They did what they could. They established a base in what remained of the largest city. They sent out expeditions to search for any functioning technology that might allow them to signal for retrieval. Months turned into years. The guardsmen died first, unable to survive indefinitely on their recycled rations and dwindling supplies. The space marines lasted longer, but even their enhanced physiology couldn't overcome malnutrition and the slow poisoning of the planet's corrupted atmosphere. One by one, they fell. And with each death, ancient Thalric became more isolated, more alone. The tech marines who could have maintained his systems were among the first to die, succumbing to injuries sustained in a final, desperate attempt to reach orbit in a damaged shuttle. Without them, Thalric's dreadnought began to fail, not catastrophically, but gradually, systems degrading one by one. His power supply fluctuated, his sensor arrays became unreliable, his Vox emitters crackled with static. On a day that would be unmarked and unremembered, his stasis systems, damaged and running on reserve power, finally activated on their own, a fail-safe designed to preserve the pilot when all else was lost. Ancient Thalric's consciousness faded into darkness. His last thought was a prayer to the Emperor, a hope that his brothers would find him, that his service would continue. And then, silence. The deep, dreamless sleep of stasis claimed him. The years became decades. The decades became centuries. Vandius Tertius was written off in imperial records as lost. Just another world swallowed by the countless disasters that plagued the Imperium. The Crimson Castellans mourned their losses and moved on, fighting new wars, recruiting new brothers, slowly forgetting the details of that ancient campaign. Occasionally, an archivist might come across the old battle reports, but they were filed away with millions of others, unremarkable in their tragedy. The world itself changed without human influence. The atmosphere, poisoned by the weapons of war, gradually settled. Acids rained from the sky, eroding the ruins of cities and fortifications. Dust storms scoured the landscape, burying trenches and bunkers under meters of reddish sand. Native plant life, mutated by the bioweapons and radiation, began to reclaim the surface. Strange and twisted vegetation that would have been unrecognizable to the farmers who had once worked these fields. The base, where the Space Marines had made their last stand, was buried beneath a dune. The shuttles they had tried to repair were reduced to skeletal frameworks, stripped by wind and sand until only the strongest materials remained. And in a reinforced bunker, 10 meters below what had once been ground level, now buried beneath layers of sand and mutated root systems, ancient Thalric slept on. His Dreadnought's power core, designed to last millennia, ticked over in minimal power mode. His stasis chamber held. The adamantium shell that protected his flesh body showed barely a sign of the centuries passing. 5,000 years. 50 centuries of absolute darkness and silence. While galaxies wheeled overhead, while empires rose and fell, while the Imperium fought 10,000 different wars on 10,000 different worlds, ancient Thalric dreamed in stasis. His mind, suspended between consciousness and oblivion, experienced something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite death. Time became meaningless. The universe continued without him, until the Orks arrived. Understanding the Dreadnought. Before we can truly appreciate what happened when the Greenskins discovered ancient Thalric, we need to understand exactly what a Dreadnought is. Because to the uninitiated, to someone who has never delved into the lore of Warhammer 40,000, the concept might seem simple. It's a big robot with a soldier inside, right? Like a mech suit from any number of science fiction settings. But that understanding would be profoundly, tragically wrong. A Dreadnought is not a vehicle. It's not a weapon system. It's not armor that can be taken off at the end of the day. A Dreadnought is a tomb. It's a prison. It's a life support system and a weapons platform, and a desperate attempt to cheat death all wrapped into one. It's one of the most honored positions a Space Marine can achieve, and simultaneously, one of the cruelest fates imaginable. To understand why requires understanding what it means to become a Dreadnought in the first place. Space Marines are superhuman warriors, created through a process that involves genetic modification, surgical alteration, and psychological conditioning. So intense, it would kill a normal human. They possess 2 hearts, 3 lungs, enhanced bone density, and the ability to function even with catastrophic injuries that would immediately kill anyone else. They can survive in environments that would be lethal to baseline humans. They can fight for days without rest. They are the Emperor's finest warriors, humanity's greatest weapon against the darkness. But even Space Marines can be broken. Even these perfect warriors can sustain injuries so severe that their enhanced healing can't save them. A direct hit from a plasma weapon that vaporizes half their body. An explosion that leaves them with only a torso and 1 arm. Crushing injuries that pulverize organs even their redundant biology can't compensate for. In the brutal conflicts of the 41st millennium, such wounds are not uncommon. For a normal soldier, these injuries mean death. For a Space Marine, who has served the Emperor for decades or even centuries, who has fought 1,000 battles and won 100 victories, there is another option. Interment. The process is as much religious ceremony as medical procedure. The dying Space Marine, his body broken beyond repair, is brought before the chapter's tech marines and apothecaries. If he is judged worthy, if his service has been exemplary, if his chapter has a Dreadnought sarcophagus available, he is offered a choice that isn't really a choice at all. He can die, his gene seed harvested to create future Space Marines, his name added to the chapter's rolls of honor, or he can continue to serve. Those who choose to continue, or who are deemed too valuable to let die, undergo a transformation that is difficult to fully describe to someone who has never contemplated the horror of it. Their remaining organic body, what little is left after their injuries, is surgically removed from what remains of their original form. Flesh is carefully excised. Bones are sectioned. The brain, the heart, maybe parts of the spine and nervous system, these are all that remain. These precious organic components are placed into a life support chamber called a sarcophagus. This sarcophagus is a marvel of technology, created using methods that date back to the dark age of technology and are only imperfectly understood even by the Adeptus Mechanicus. It's filled with amniotic fluids that sustain the organic remains. Neural interface plugs connect directly to the Space Marine's brain and nervous system. Chemical regulators maintain the delicate balance of hormones and nutrients needed to keep the fragments of flesh alive. Monitoring systems track every biological function, ready to compensate for any failing. And then this sarcophagus, with its cargo of what was once a mighty warrior reduced to organic components floating in fluid, is installed into the Dreadnought chassis. The neural interfaces are connected to the walker's systems. What was once flesh becomes metal. Arms that could once grip a weapon are replaced with assault cannons and missile launchers. Legs that could run and jump are replaced with pneumatic pistons and servo motors. The Space Marine's senses, his sight and hearing and touch, are replaced with optical sensors and audio pickups and pressure sensors spread across the Dreadnought's armored hide. The transformation is complete. The Space Marine is dead. Long live the Dreadnought. But here's where the true horror begins. Because the warrior inside, his consciousness, his memories, his sense of self, all of that remains. He is aware, he thinks, he feels, after a fashion, though the sensations are filtered through machines and translated by computers into something his human brain can interpret. He can speak, though his voice is now a synthesized crackling of vox speakers. He can move, though every step is the mechanical thud of tons of armor and weapons. He experiences the world through a barrier of technology that can never be removed, and he will experience it that way forever. There is no retirement for a Dreadnought. There is no honorable discharge. Once interred, a Space Marine cannot be removed from his sarcophagus without death. He is bonded to the machine in ways both physical and psychological. To be removed would be to die. And so he serves. He fights when called upon, and when not fighting, he sleeps. This is where the true genius and cruelty of the Dreadnought design becomes apparent. You see, the human mind, even a mind as conditioned and enhanced as a Space Marine's, was never meant to exist in such a state indefinitely. The sensory deprivation, the isolation from human contact, the inability to ever touch or taste or experience the world in the ways we take for granted, these things exact a terrible psychological toll. Dreadnoughts who remain awake and active for extended periods begin to deteriorate mentally. They become confused about where they are and when. They experience dyschronometria, a condition where their sense of time becomes fundamentally distorted. They develop lethargy and depression. Some go mad entirely. To prevent this, chapters put their Dreadnoughts into stasis sleep between battles. The neural interfaces are carefully shut down. The consciousness of the warrior inside is suspended, placed into a state that is neither sleep nor unconsciousness, but something else entirely. They are, for all intents and purposes, frozen in time. And there they remain, in sealed vaults, deep within their chapter's fortress monastery, until they are needed again. This sleep can last for years, decades. Some of the oldest dreadnoughts, the venerable ones, have been in service for thousands of years, but they've been awake for perhaps only a few decades total. The rest of that time was spent in darkness, in the void of stasis, waiting for the call to battle that might come next month or next century. Time becomes meaningless. Each awakening brings with it the disorientation of not knowing how long has passed. The familiar faces of battle brothers are gone, replaced by strangers who wear the same colors. The galaxy has moved on. The dreadnought has not. And with each awakening, each period of activity followed by another stint in stasis, something is lost. Memories fade. Personality erodes. The organic brain inside the sarcophagus is sustained but not perfectly preserved. Neural pathways degrade. The warrior who was once a vibrant, living person becomes something else. The machine remains functional even as the mind within slowly disintegrates across the centuries. The oldest dreadnoughts are respected not despite this deterioration, but because of it. They have served so long, sacrificed so much of themselves, that they are living embodiments of their chapter's history. They remember battles fought when the chapter was young. They knew warriors who are now legends. They carry within their degrading memories knowledge that would otherwise be lost. When they speak, it is with the weight of ages. When they fight, it is with the accumulated experience of countless campaigns. But there is also something profoundly tragic about them. They are, in a very real sense, ghosts, echoes of warriors long dead, kept functioning by machines they don't fully understand, forced to serve in a galaxy they no longer recognize. They are honored, yes, revered even, but they are also pitied, though none would ever say so aloud. To be a dreadnought is to have your life extended far beyond its natural span, but at the cost of everything that made that life worth living. And now imagine being one of these warriors, sealed in your adamantium tomb, your consciousness suspended in stasis, unaware that instead of decades or even centuries, 5,000 years have passed. 50 centuries during which your chapter has either been destroyed or changed beyond recognition. During which every battle brother you ever knew has died and been forgotten. During which the wars you fought have become footnotes in archives that were themselves destroyed. During which the very galaxy has been fundamentally altered. And then imagine waking up. Not to the familiar sounds of your chapter's tech marines performing reactivation rituals. Not to the chanting of prayers and the smell of sacred oils. Not to the formal briefing of your deployment orders, delivered by officers whose names you recognize. No. Imagine waking up to the sounds of crude machinery, to voices speaking a brutal, guttural language you recognize from 1,000 battlefields, to the sensation of hands, large and rough, prodding at your hull with all the delicacy of sledgehammers, to the growing, horrifying realization that you are surrounded not by your brothers, not by fellow servants of the Emperor, but by Orks. This is the situation ancient Thauric was about to find himself in. The nature of Orks. To understand why the discovery of a dreadnought by Orks is such a perfect storm of dark comedy and genuine horror, you need to understand what Orks are. And that's actually more complicated than it might first appear, because Orks in Warhammer 40,000 are not simple creatures, despite what their violent, straightforward approach to existence might suggest. Orks are, fundamentally, weapons. Living weapons, created millions of years ago during a conflict so ancient and so devastating that it makes the endless warfare of the 41st millennium look like a minor skirmish. They were engineered by beings called the Old Ones, ancient and incomprehensibly advanced entities who fought a war against the Necrons and their Satan masters. The Old Ones needed soldiers, warriors who could fight and survive and adapt to the changing conditions of galactic warfare. So they created the Krork, the ancestors of modern Orks, and they encoded into their very genetics everything they would need to wage war across the stars. This is why orcs are the way they are. Their biology is a perfect marriage of animal and fungal characteristics, designed for maximum survivability and rapid reproduction. When an orc dies, his body releases spores that will eventually grow into new orcs, along with other orcoid organisms like Gretchen and squigs. This means that orcs don't need to worry about logistics or reproduction in the traditional sense. You can't truly exterminate them. Even if you kill every orc on a world, unless you burn the entire planet to bedrock, those spores will remain, and eventually, new orcs will arise. They're also massive. An average orc stands taller than a human, with a hunched, powerful build that's all muscle and aggression. Their green skin is tougher than human flesh, resistant to damage and capable of healing from wounds that would cripple others. They have a simple but effective circulatory system and redundant organs. Their brains are remarkably resilient, able to function even with damage that would leave a human vegetative. They don't feel pain the way we do. They don't experience fear in any meaningful sense. They exist in a state of perpetual aggressive joy, delighting in violence and conflict. But here's what makes them truly terrifying, truly alien. Orcs have a collective psychic field, a sort of gestalt consciousness that all orcs contribute to and benefit from. This field is not the result of individual orcs being psychic, though some are. Those are called weird boys, and they're a whole different story. No, this is something else entirely. It's an ambient psychic radiation that orcs give off simply by existing, and it gets stronger the more orcs there are in one place. This field has strange effects. It makes orc technology work when by all rights it shouldn't. An orc gun might be literally hammered together from scrap metal, with no proper firing mechanism, no properly machined barrel, ammunition that's just random bits of metal shoved into a chamber. By every law of physics and engineering, it should explode in the orc's hands or simply fail to fire at all. But if the orc believes it will work, if he points it at an enemy and pulls the trigger with absolute conviction that Daka will come out, then the psychic field makes it work. The bullets fire, the enemy dies. The laws of physics take a back seat to orc belief. This extends to all aspects of their technology. Orc vehicles shouldn't be able to move. They're welded together from random parts, with no proper engine design, running on fuel that's essentially just whatever flammable liquid was available. But orcs paint them red because red ones go faster, and the psychic field makes it so. They paint bombs yellow because yellow is explodia, and it works. Purple is sneaky, so orcs wearing purple actually become harder to spot. It's insane. It defies everything we know about how the universe should work. But in the presence of enough orcs, reality itself bends to accommodate their beliefs. Now this doesn't mean orcs can do literally anything through belief. They can't wish a space marine out of existence or believe themselves immune to bullets. The psychic field works within limits. It makes things that should almost work actually work. It bridges the gap between crude but conceptually sound designs and functional technology. An orc can't make a gun work by taping sticks together and calling it a shooter. But if they create something that looks like a gun and has the basic components, even if assembled wrong, the field will compensate for the poor craftsmanship. And this brings us to the mech boys, the orc caste that's going to be central to our story. Mech boys are special. They're orcs, yes, but they're born with something extra: genetic memory, instinctive knowledge of technology and engineering that's hard-coded into their DNA, a legacy from the old ones who created their race. A mech boy knows how to build things without being taught. He understands mechanical principles at an intuitive level. Show him a broken engine and he'll know how to fix it, even if he's never seen that specific engine design before. This knowledge is crude, fragmentary, more feeling than formal understanding.
You know, I have to pause here for a second because this scenario genuinely fascinates me. I've been digging into Warhammer lore for quite a while, and the Dreadnought has always struck me as one of the most tragic concepts in the entire setting. Like, we celebrate them as these honored ancients, these revered warriors, but really, Their consciousness trapped in metal coffins, waking up every few decades or centuries to fight, then going back into darkness. It's actually horrifying. But yeah, that's just my opinion. Back to the story.
A mech boy can't explain how a plasma reactor works using physics equations. But he can look at one and say, "Dat bit there needs more juice, and this bit's gonna go boom if you don't tighten dat gubbins." He builds by instinct, welding and hammering and connecting components in ways that make no sense on paper, but somehow create functional technology. And because he believes it will work, because the psychic field amplifies that belief, it does. Mech boys are invaluable to Ork society. They build the weapons, they maintain the vehicles, they create the bizarre contraptions that make Ork warfare so chaotic and unpredictable. Shock attack guns that teleport snotlings directly into enemy armor, custom force fields that project bubbles of protective energy, def dreads, which are the Ork equivalent of dreadnoughts, crude walking tanks with an Ork wired directly into the machine. And mech boys have another critical characteristic. They're curious. Well, curious in an Orky way. When they see technology they don't understand, technology from other races, their instinct isn't to run away or destroy it outright. Their instinct is to figure out how it works, to take it apart, to see if they can make it better, which in Ork terms usually means louder, shootier, or explodier. They loot, they scavenge, they experiment. This is what makes Orks such a terrifying force in the galaxy. They're not just mindless barbarians. They're adaptable. They learn, not in the way humans learn, not through careful study and documentation, but they learn nonetheless. An Ork warband that fights against the Tau will start incorporating Tau technology into their own weapons. Orks that battle Necrons will begin experimenting with Gauss technology. They're the ultimate scavengers, the ultimate adapters, taking the best of every species they encounter and making it Orky. They're also incredibly numerous. Orkoid spores are everywhere. On almost every habitable world in the galaxy, there are feral Ork populations, small tribes that exist in the wilderness, waiting for something to trigger their growth. And when a large enough group of Orks gathers in one place, when the psychic field grows strong enough, something changes. They begin to organize. The biggest, strongest Orks become bosses. The bosses fight each other for dominance. Eventually, one becomes the warlord, the biggest, meanest Ork around. And when a warlord achieves sufficient size and power, when the psychic field reaches critical mass, they launch what's called a Great Crusade, a massive military campaign where millions or even billions of Orks gather under one leader and sweep across the galaxy, conquering and destroying everything in their path. These crusades are driven by a combination of psychic compulsion and sheer joy. Orks love fighting. They live for it. It's not just their purpose, it's their pleasure. Every Ork dreams of being in the best scrap, fighting the strongest enemies, making the loudest noise. So when we talk about Orks finding an ancient dreadnought, we're not talking about savages stumbling across something they can't understand. We're talking about a species genetically engineered for warfare, with instinctive technological knowledge and a psychic field that makes the impossible possible, discovering a piece of technology that represents everything they love: violence, power, and the opportunity to take something apart and see how it works. The Orks who found ancient Thalric's tomb weren't just any random warband. Let me tell you about them. The warband arrives. Warboss Grimtooth was having what he would describe as a proper good time. His warband, roughly 300 strong and growing every day as more Orks emerged from the spores scattered across the region, had been rampaging through this sector of space for the better part of 2 years. They'd sacked an Imperial outpost, smashed up some Tau colonists, and most recently had thoroughly enjoyed themselves in a massive scrap with another Ork warband over who had the right to loot a crashed spacecraft. Grimtooth had won that fight, naturally. He was the biggest after all, and his power claw had ripped the rival boss literally in half. The victory had been satisfying, But now his boys were getting restless. They'd looted everything worth looting from the crash site. The fighting was done. Orks without something to fight or something to loot got ornery and started scrapping among themselves, which was fun, but wasteful. Grimtooth needed to find them a new target. That's when Grabbits, his chief mech boy, brought him interesting news. Their ramshackle sensors, cobbled together from Imperial equipment and Ork ingenuity, had detected something unusual on a nearby world. Energy readings. Faint, yes, but consistent with power, sources buried underground. In Ork terms, that meant one thing: loot. The world didn't look like much. It was a reddish-brown orb, its surface scarred and barren, wrapped in an atmosphere that sensor readings suggested was toxic, even by Ork standards. But Orks don't care much about comfort. If there was loot down there, they'd breathe through filters, or hold their breath, or just tough it out. Grimtooth gave the order, and the Warband's collection of ramshackle ships descended toward the surface in what could charitably be called a landing, and more accurately be described as a barely controlled crash. The Orks spilled out of their landing craft in a green tide of enthusiasm. The world was dead. That much was immediately obvious. Dead and had been for a very long time. But dead worlds often had the best loot, abandoned by whoever used to live there, and just waiting for enterprising Orks to claim it. They spread out in mobs, each group led by a nob, searching the ruins that poked through, the sand dunes, like the bones of some ancient beast. This had been a city once, though you'd have to look carefully to see it now. The buildings were worn down to foundations, their upper stories long since eroded away. Streets were buried under meters of sand. Here and there, more durable structures remained, their adamantium reinforcements still intact after 5 millennia. The Orks poked through these with great interest, finding very little. Whatever had happened here had been thorough. The place had been stripped clean, either by the original inhabitants or by the forces that destroyed them. But Grabbits wasn't interested in the surface ruins. His sensors were telling him the power source was underground, and significantly so. He led a mob of boys to what looked like it might have once been some kind of facility. The entrance was buried, but Orks are excellent diggers. It's in their genetic memory from their fungal origins. They dug with enthusiasm, shifting tons of sand and debris, revealing a reinforced entrance that bore the mark of the Imperial Aquila, faded and corroded, but still recognizable. The door was sealed, locked by mechanisms that had survived millennia of neglect. A human salvage team might have spent hours trying to bypass the locks, accessing control panels and working through security protocols. The Orks, demonstrating the straightforward problem-solving approach that defines their species, simply hit it with a power claw until it broke. The entrance opened into darkness. The Orks, unbothered by the lack of light, activated glow rods that some of them had looted from somewhere, casting a sickly green illumination into the depths. The facility beyond was a bunker, clearly military in origin. The walls were reinforced ceramite. The floor was designed to support heavy equipment. And everywhere, dust. Dust so thick it was clear nothing living had disturbed it in countless years. They found bodies first. Space Marine bodies, still clad in power armor, collapsed in various locations throughout the facility. The armor was corroded, the colors faded to almost nothing. But Orks recognize Space Marine armor when they see it. They'd fought enough of the Emperor's finest to know what they looked like. These ones had been dead a long time. Some of the Orks examined the bodies with interest, looking for anything worth looting. The weapons were seized, degraded, the ammunition long since deteriorated, but the armor plates might still be useful. Grabbits paid them little attention. His sensor, a handheld device he'd built from 3 different species technology welded together with faith and enthusiasm, was pulling him deeper. The power source was close, very close. He led his mob through corridors that showed signs of long-ago damage, battle scars on the walls, blast marks that had faded but never disappeared. They descended a ramp into what must have been a sub-level, a secure section of the bunker designed for critical equipment. And there, in a chamber that had once been carefully climate-controlled and religiously maintained, they found it. The Dreadnought stood in an alcove, secured in what looked like a maintenance cradle. Red sand had infiltrated even here through cracks in the ceiling, forming drifts around the walker's feet. The massive war machine was motionless, its weapons powered down, its hull showing signs of age, but still fundamentally intact. The adamantium armor had weathered the millennia well. The chapter symbols on its carapace were worn but visible, the crimson and silver colors of the crimson castellans still recognizable under the dust and corrosion. To the Orks, it was beautiful, not in any aesthetic sense that humans would understand, but in the Orky, appreciation for violence and power made manifest. This was a weapon, a big weapon, a shooty, stompy weapon that was just sitting here, unclaimed, waiting for someone with the know-how and the guts to make it work. Grabbits approached it with the reverence that a mech boy reserves for particularly interesting technology. His warty green hands ran over the hull, feeling the texture of the adamantium, finding access panels and weapon mounts. His genetic memory stirred. He'd never seen a Space Marine Dreadnought up close before, at least not one that wasn't actively trying to kill him. But the principles were familiar. It was a walker. It had a pilot inside. It had weapons and sensors and locomotion systems. The details might be different from Ork technology, might use techniques and materials that the Imperium jealously guarded, but the fundamentals? Those he understood. Other Orks gathered around, peering at the Dreadnought with interest. One of the boys, a particularly enthusiastic one named Gutsnik, raised his slugger and pointed it at the machine, clearly thinking about just shooting it to see what would happen. Grabbits hit him so hard the Ork flew backward into two of his fellows. "Don't even think about
It, you get,
Grabbits roared.
This here is quality loots. We ain't gonna damage it by being stupid. We're gonna figure out how it works, and then we're gonna make it Orky.
The statement drew approving grunts from the gathered Orks. Making things Orky was always a popular suggestion. It usually involved adding more guns, more armor, painting things in lurid colors, and a general increase in the capacity for violence. All good things in Ork estimation. Grabbits began his examination in earnest, and this is where the true nature of Ork technological prowess became evident. He didn't have any documentation. He didn't have any schematics. He'd never been trained in Space Marine technology, but he didn't need any of that. His hands found access panels and opened them, revealing the complex machinery within. His eyes, small and red, and gleaming with an intelligence that belied the brutish appearance, scanned the systems and began to understand them. Power supply here, neural interface, connections there. Life support systems, remarkably sophisticated, clustered around what must be the sarcophagus, locomotion servos, weapon feeds, sensor arrays. Each component was examined, understood at a level that was more intuition than knowledge, and catalogued. Grabbits began to mutter to himself in the strange combination of low Gothic, Orkish, and mechanical terminology that mech boys used when they were working. Other mech boys from the warband joined him. Ork society doesn't really do rank in the way humans understand it, but there's definitely a hierarchy, and mech boys of lesser skill deferred to Grabbits's greater expertise. Together, they began the process that Orks excelled at, figuring out how to make the enemy's technology serve their purposes. It took them 3 days. 3 days of examination and experimentation and occasional small explosions when someone connected something to something else that shouldn't have been connected. They traced power conduits and tested systems. They figured out the basics of how the Dreadnought's machine spirit, the quasi-sentient programming that governed autonomous functions, worked. They identified the weapon systems and spent a happy hour figuring out how the assault cannon loaded and fired. And they found the stasis chamber. It was Grabbits who made the discovery, working his way through the life support systems. The sarcophagus was sealed, its access panels locked not just physically, but with what looked like cryptographic seals, high Gothic prayers etched into the metal as both wards and passwords. An Imperial tech marine would have known the proper litanies to open them, would have gone through the sacred rituals that allowed access to the sleeping warrior within. Grabbits just hit the seals with a wrench until they broke. The panels popped open, revealing the complex machinery that sustained the pilot. And there, in the heart of it all, Grabbits could see him. The Space Marine. Or what was left of one, floating in amniotic fluid, barely recognizable as having once been human, was the organic core that ancient Thalric had been reduced to. Flesh pale from millennia without sunlight. Neural connections running from the brain and spine into the machinery. Life support tubes carrying fluids in and out. "Core," said one of the boys, peering over Grabbits' shoulder. "That's what's inside Dazer things. That's what the Yumi Marines look like in there." "Quiet, you git," Grabbits muttered, his attention focused. This was fascinating. He'd built Def Dreads before, wired Orks into walking weapons. But this was so much more sophisticated. The integration was seamless. The systems were designed to last not years but centuries, millennia even. Every redundancy had a backup. Every critical system had fail-safes, and the stasis field generator, now that he'd found it, was clearly still active, running on minimal power, preserving the Space Marine inside in a state of perfect suspension. Grabbits understood stasis technology at a conceptual level. Orks used it sometimes, usually accidentally when they messed around with Xenos tech. But this was deliberate, carefully engineered, absolutely reliable. A thought occurred to him, a wonderful, terrible, perfectly Orky thought. "What if," he said slowly, speaking as much to himself as to the other mech boys, "what if we could wake it up?" The suggestion was met with a moment of silence as the implications sunk in. Then, as one, the gathered Orks began to grin. It was the kind of grin that, on a human face, would have been terrifying. On Ork faces, it was absolutely gleeful. Wake up the ancient war machine, see what happened. Maybe it would fight them. That would be fun. Maybe they could make it fight for them. That would also be fun. Maybe it would explode in a spectacular fashion. That would be very fun. There was literally no downside to this plan from an Ork perspective. Grabbits began examining the stasis systems with renewed purpose. He needed to understand how they worked before he could deactivate them. Or, well, he didn't strictly need to understand them, but it would help. Probably. Maybe. Okay, he was probably just going to hit things until something happened, but it was good to at least know which things to hit. The other mech boys began assisting, offering suggestions that ranged from somewhat useful to catastrophically dangerous. More Orks gathered to watch, word having spread through the warband that something interesting was happening. Warboss Grimturf himself showed up, his massive bulk barely fitting through the corridors, to see what all the fuss was about. When Grabbits explained that they'd found an ancient war machine with a Humi inside it and were planning to wake it up, Grimtooth's response was characteristically direct. "Make sure it's got lots of ammo first," he rumbled. "If it's gonna wake up and start shooting, I want to see proper Daka." This was considered sound tactical advice, and several boys were dispatched to see if they could find anything in the facility that might work as ammunition for the assault cannon. They came back with some rusted ammunition canisters that might have once held bolter rounds. Whether they'd work in a Dreadnought's weapons was anyone's guess, but Orks have never let uncertainty stop them from trying something. Grabbits, meanwhile, had figured out what he thought was the control system for the stasis field. It was remarkably simple, really. A series of runes on a control panel, each one corresponding to different functions. He couldn't read High Gothic, of course, but he didn't need to. He could see the power flow. He could trace which runes connected to which systems. He placed his meaty green hand on what he was pretty sure was the activation rune, or possibly the deactivation rune. The distinction was a bit unclear. Either way, pushing it would do something interesting. "Right then," he announced to the gathered Orks. "Everyone get ready. This is gonna be good." The Orks readied their weapons, not because they expected trouble, not really, but because being ready for a fight is just how Orks exist. If nothing happened, fine. If something did happen, They wanted to be prepared to enjoy it. Grabbits pushed the rune. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, deep within the Dreadnought systems, power that had been held in careful reserve for 5,000 years began to flow. Circuits that had been dormant activated. The stasis field, that bubble of frozen time that had held ancient Thalric in perfect suspension, began to collapse. And in his sarcophagus, in the darkness that had been his entire reality for 50 centuries, ancient Thalric began to wake. The ancient stirs. The first thing was sensation, not sight or sound, but a vague awareness that something had changed. For 5,000 years, there had been nothing. No dreams, no thoughts, no passage of time. Perfect stasis is, by definition, a state where nothing happens, where time itself is held at bay. To call it sleep would be wrong. Sleep involves brain activity, dreams, the processing of memories. This had been absence, complete and total. But now, impossibly, that absence was ending. Systems that had been powered down began to initialize. The life support chamber that contained ancient Thalric's biological remains began receiving power again. Chemical balances that had been frozen were allowed to resume. The neural interface connections, dormant for so long, started carrying signals again. It was an incredibly gradual process, designed that way deliberately. You can't just shock a consciousness back to awareness after centuries of stasis. The process has to be gentle, carefully managed, allowing the mind to adjust to its own existence again. In the darkness of his sarcophagus, ancient Thalric's consciousness began to reassemble itself. It started with pure awareness. I am. I exist. Then slowly more complex thoughts. I was asleep. I am waking. Why? The neural interfaces carried information from the Dreadnought systems to what remained of his brain. Diagnostic data, status reports, power levels. All of this was processed, not intellectually, but at a subconscious level, his mind automatically interpreting the signals it was receiving. His Dreadnought was operational, damaged, yes, systems degraded, but functional. The information should have been routine. He'd woken from stasis dozens of times during his service. The process was familiar, but something was wrong. The data was wrong. Power reserves too low, armor integrity compromised, sensor arrays malfunctioning. And the chronometer, when his mind finally focused on it, when he finally processed what it was telling him, the chronometer said that 5,047 years had passed since the last time he'd been awakened. That couldn't be right. That was impossible. 5,000 years. No, there must be an error. The stasis had lasted decades, at most. Perhaps a century, if the chapter had faced some catastrophic setback that delayed his recovery. But 5,000 years? His consciousness grasped at that number, tried to understand it, and failed. 5,000 years. 50 centuries. Time so vast it was meaningless. The Great Crusade had been 10,000 years ago. The Horus heresy, that great betrayal that had nearly destroyed the Imperium, was 10,000 years in the past. Everything in the Imperium was measured against that apocalyptic event. And he had been asleep for half that time? No. The chronometer must be malfunctioning. That was the only explanation. He tried to access other systems, to verify the time, but found his control sluggish. The neural interface was responding, but slowly, as if the pathways were corroded or damaged. He tried to speak, to activate his vox emitters, and heard only a crackle of static. Panic, real panic, began to set in. He was entombed in a dreadnought whose systems were failing. His chronometer was reading impossibilities. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He was trapped, aware, but helpless, in a shell of metal that might very well be his tomb in truth. Then his audio sensors finally activated. The first thing he heard was voices. Voices speaking a language he recognized instantly from 1,000 battlefields. A brutal, guttural tongue that made mockery of civilized speech. Orkish. Orks. There were orcs nearby, very nearby by the sound of it. Ancient Thalric felt his combat instincts, honed over centuries of warfare, immediately kick in. Orcs meant combat. Combat meant he needed to be operational, needed to bring his weapons online, needed to prepare for battle. He sent commands through the neural interface to his weapons systems. The assault cannon mounted on his right arm should spin up. The power fist on his left should activate its energy field. He should be able to turn, to scan his surroundings, to acquire targets. Nothing happened. The weapons didn't respond. His locomotion systems didn't engage. He couldn't turn his hull to see what was around him. He was blind, immobile, helpless. A terrible realization washed over him. He wasn't operational. The stasis had preserved him, yes, but the Dreadnought itself was damaged, possibly critically so. And there were orcs nearby, doing Emperor knew what to his chassis. He tried again to access his Vox systems, pouring more mental effort into the command, overriding safety protocols in his desperation to communicate, to understand what was happening. The Vox emitter crackled, sparked, and finally produced sound. His voice, or what passed for it, emerged as a grinding mechanical rasp, distorted by millennia of degradation. Identify yourself. The effect on the orcs was immediate and dramatic. The Great Awakening. When ancient Thalric's Vox emitters crackled to life, speaking Gothic in a voice like grinding metal, the response from the assembled orcs was a moment of perfect silence. 100 greenskins, all crowded into the chamber to watch Grabbits work on the interesting Humitech, went absolutely still for about 3 seconds. Then they erupted in delighted laughter.
It talks,
One of the boys shouted.
Zoginel Grabbits, you woke it up,
Another cheered.
I knew this would be good.
A third added, chambering around in his slugger. Grabbits himself was grinning so wide his tusks seemed in danger of meeting around the back of his head.
Oi,
He shouted at the Dreadnought, leaning close to what he'd identified as the main sensor cluster.
can you hear me, you big metal git? You're on our turf now.
Inside his sarcophagus, ancient Thalric processed this. The orc was speaking to him, directly addressing him. The audacity of it would have been amusing under other circumstances. An orc, a xenos, a creature the Imperium had been fighting for 10,000 years, was treating him like a piece of salvage they'd found and successfully activated. He tried again, to move, to bring his weapons online, but his systems remained sluggish. He could feel power flowing through his chassis now, but it wasn't distributing properly. Conduits were blocked or damaged. Connections that should have been smooth were corroded. After 5,000 years of neglect, his Dreadnought needed serious maintenance before it would be battle-ready. But he could speak. That much worked. And if he could speak, he could learn what had happened, where he was, why there were orcs instead of his battle brothers.
Where?
His Vox emitter ground out, each word an effort.
Am I? What has happened?
The orcs found this hilarious. Several of them were literally rolling on the floor, clutching their sides. The idea of the Humi war machine asking questions, sounding confused, apparently struck them as the funniest thing they'd encountered in weeks. Grabbits, to his credit, tried to be informative. As informative as an orc can be, anyway.
You're on some dead rock in the middle of nowhere, he explained cheerfully. Been here a long time, by the look of it. All covered in dust and rust. But we found you, and we woke you up, and now you're gonna be orky. Gonna paint you in proper colours, give you more daka, make you proper killy.
The words filtered through ancient Thalric's consciousness. A dead world, covered in dust. He'd been here a long time. Slowly, horribly, understanding began to dawn. He'd never been retrieved. His brothers hadn't come for him. The war on Vandius Tertius had ended. He remembered that. Remembered being placed into stasis because there was no more fighting and resources were scarce. He'd been told it would be temporary. Just until the fleet returned. Just until they could be retrieved. They'd never come. The fleet had left. Or been destroyed. Or simply forgotten about them. And he'd lain here, in stasis, while the years turned to decades, turned to centuries, turned to millennia. The chapter had abandoned him. Not deliberately, perhaps. Not cruelly.
but the result was the same. He'd been forgotten, left to sleep in a bunker on a dead world until time and decay claimed him. Except now he'd been found, not by the Imperium, not by his chapter, but by Orks. A sound emerged from his vox emitters. It might have been a laugh, or it might have been a sob. With vox speakers, it was hard to tell. After 5,000 years of suspension, after waking to find himself alone on a dead world, surrounded by the enemy, his weapons non-functional and his chassis deteriorating, ancient Thalric discovered that he was feeling something he'd never truly experienced in all his centuries of service. Despair. But despair in a space marine, in a warrior who has already died once and been brought back to serve in a walking tomb. Despair doesn't lead to surrender, it leads to anger. And anger in a dreadnought has very specific outlets. "I am," his voice crackled, growing stronger as more power flowed to his vox systems. "Ancient Thalric, of the Crimson Castellans, chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, I have served the Emperor for 300 years. I have fought across 100 battlefields. I have slain thousands of his enemies." The Orks were still grinning, but some of them were beginning to pay closer attention. The Humi sounded like it was working up to something. "And I will not," Thalric continued, pouring every ounce of his will into his neural interface, forcing power to flow where it was blocked, overriding damaged systems through sheer determination. "I will not be claimed by Xenos filth." Something clicked. Some corroded connection, forced into operation by the sudden surge of neural commands, finally made contact. Power, blessed power, flowed to his locomotion servos. Ancient Thalric, for the first time in 5,000 years, moved. It wasn't graceful. One leg jerked forward with a grinding screech of metal on metal, servos that hadn't operated in millennia protesting the sudden demand. But it moved. And where one system could be forced back into operation, others could follow. The Orks, to their credit, reacted with characteristic speed. As soon as the dreadnought shifted, weapons came up. Sluggas and shooters were pointed at the metal giant. Boys started backing away, giving themselves room to maneuver. A few, the really enthusiastic ones, started moving forward instead, eager to get stuck in. Grabbits, caught between professional interest in how the war machine was functioning and personal interest in not getting crushed, scrambled backward, shouting commands. "Oi, get ready, boys. Looks like we got ourselves a scrap." Inside his sarcophagus, Thalric was experiencing something close to joy. His body, such as it was, couldn't feel anything anymore. But his mind, his warrior's spirit, felt the dreadnought moving under his control, felt the power flowing through systems that were beginning to respond. His weapons were still offline, his sensors still degraded, but he could move. He could fight. He took another step, and this one was smoother. His neural pathways were remembering how to interface with the machine. Ancient knowledge, drilled into him during his initial training as a dreadnought pilot, was reasserting itself. Turn the torso here, shift weight there, distribute power to the legs, balance the massive chassis. He tried his weapons again. The assault cannon refused to activate. The ammunition feed seized after millennia of disuse. But the power fist, that ancient piece of technology that amplified force through a disruption field, that responded. Not fully, not properly, but there was a faint crackle of energy around the massive metal fist, a sign that the weapon was attempting to activate. It would have to be enough. He took a third step, and the motion was almost smooth. He turned, his sensor suite finally coming online enough to give him a grainy, degraded view of his surroundings. The bunker, exactly as he remembered it, though buried under sand and decorated with orcish graffiti now, and orcs. Orcs everywhere, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, throughout the facility. Under normal circumstances, a functioning dreadnought would have torn through them like paper. Ancient Thalric had faced orc hordes before. He knew their tactics, their weaknesses. A sustained burst from his assault cannon would have cut down ranks of them. His power fist
would have crushed their vehicles and smashed their weapons. He was designed to be a one-machine army, capable of turning the tide of battle through sheer firepower and resilience. But these were not normal circumstances. His assault cannon was dead. His power fist was barely functional. His armor, while still largely intact, was weakened by corrosion. His sensors gave him only the most basic awareness of his surroundings, and his reactor, while operational, was running at perhaps 30% of normal capacity. He was, in short, a crippled shadow of what he should have been. The Orks, bless their simple hearts, didn't care. They saw a Hume Dreadnought starting to move, starting to fight, and their response was universal and immediate. They opened fire. The bunker erupted in noise and violence. Sluggas barked, firing crude solid rounds that sparked off Thalric's armor. Shooters chattered, spraying bullets wildly in his general direction. A few of the Orks had heavier weapons, looted from Emperor New Ware, and these spoke with deeper voices. A rocket launcher burped out a missile that streaked across the chamber and impacted against Thalric's torso, the explosion actually staggering him. Pain, or the closest approximation his mechanical senses could provide, flared through his consciousness. Damage alerts cascaded across his awareness. Armor breach, structural damage to chest plating, sensor cluster 4 offline. His already degraded condition was getting worse with every hit. But ancient Thalric had 300 years of combat experience. He'd been wounded before. He'd fought while damaged before. You didn't survive as long as he had. Didn't earn the right to be interred in a dreadnought in the first place, without learning how to keep fighting even when everything was going wrong. He charged, not a graceful charge, not the smooth, purposeful advance of a properly functioning war machine, but a stumbling, grinding rush forward, servos screaming in protest, armor shedding flakes of corroded metal with every step. His power fist, crackling with what little energy it could muster, swung in a wide arc. It connected with an Ork who'd been too slow to get out of the way, and the result was spectacular. Even degraded, even operating at a fraction of its design capacity, a dreadnought's power fist was a devastating weapon. The Ork was quite literally pulverized, reduced to a green smear across the bunker floor. The other Orks loved it. "Now that's what I'm talking about!" Grimtooth roared from somewhere in the back. "Proper scrapping! Get in there, boys! Show the Hume what we're made of!" What followed was less a battle and more a brawl, the kind of chaotic, enthusiastic violence that Orks excelled at. They swarmed Thalric from all sides, firing their weapons, swinging their choppers against his armor, attempting to climb up his chassis to find weak points. Several were crushed or knocked aside by his power fist. Others were kicked away by his massive feet. But there were always more. Always. For ancient Thalric, the fight was an exercise in desperation. Every movement stressed his damaged systems further. Every blow he took degraded his armor more. He was fighting on borrowed time, and he knew it. His reactor was overheating. His locomotion servos were beginning to fail. His sensor suite was glitching, showing him ghost images and false readings. But he kept fighting. What else was there to do? Surrender was not in a Space Marine's vocabulary. Death, proper death, would be a mercy. But until it came, he would do his duty. He would fight the Emperor's enemies, even if those enemies were gleefully enjoying every second of the combat, even if he was outnumbered 100-1, even if his only possible fate was to fall here, on this forgotten world, his second death going as unremembered as his first. A lucky shot from a rocket launcher hit his left leg, and the joint gave way. Thalric crashed to one knee, his massive bulk shaking the bunker. More Orks swarmed over him. He swung his power fist in a wide arc, scattering them, but he couldn't get back up. His locomotion was compromised. Inside his sarcophagus, fluid dynamics calculations told him he had perhaps 3 minutes before catastrophic systems failure. 3 minutes before his reactor went critical, or his life support failed, or some other vital system gave out. 3 minutes left of a life that had spanned 300 years of flesh and 5,000 years of sleep. He accepted it. This was how it would end. Fighting, surrounded by enemies, going down swinging,
It was a good death, as far as deaths went. Better than rusting away in stasis. Better than being forgotten entirely. He prepared one final surge, planning to overload his power fist, to create an explosion that would take as many of the Xenos with him as possible. And then Grabbits did something unexpected. The mech boy, who'd been watching the fight with great interest from a relatively safe distance, suddenly began shouting, not in battle lust, in alarm. "Oi! Oi! Stop! Everybody stop!" The command was so unusual, so contrary to how Orks normally behaved in the middle of a scrap, that it actually worked. The boys, confused but obedient to one of their own odd boys, ceased their assault. They stepped back, weapons still ready, looking at Grabbits with expressions that suggested he'd better have a good explanation. Grabbits was staring at Thalric's chassis with an expression of horror. Well, horror mixed with fascination. Mostly fascination, really. This was a mech boy after all. "You gits are gonna wreck it," he shouted. "Look at it, it's barely holding together. If we keep shooting it, it's gonna fall apart completely. And then we won't have anything to work with." Warboss Grimtooth pushed through the crowd, his massive form casting a shadow over the kneeling Dreadnought. He looked at Thalric, then at Grabbits, then back at Thalric. "So what are you saying?" he rumbled. Grabbits' eyes gleamed with an enthusiasm that was deeply worrying. "I'm saying, we don't wreck it, we fix it." What happens next? The pronouncement hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Fix it. The mech boy wanted to repair the Dreadnought, an ancient Imperial war machine piloted by a space marine, enemy of the Ork race for 10,000 years. Fix it. Ancient Thalric, still on one knee, his systems failing, processed this through a haze of damage alerts and approaching shutdown. The Orks wanted to repair him? That made no sense. Unless... Oh no. They wanted to repair him so they could use him. Make him part of their warband. Force him to fight for them. The ultimate humiliation. The final insult. Not just to be defeated by Xenos, but to be made into their tool, their weapon, serving the very creatures he'd spent his life destroying. He tried to speak, tried to voice his refusal, his absolute rejection of any fate that involved serving the enemy. But his vox emitters chose that moment to finally fail completely. The surge of power he'd channeled through them, having burned out the already degraded systems. He could hear, he could think, but he couldn't communicate. The discussion among the Orks continued without him. "Fix it?" one of the knobs asked, skepticism clear in his voice. "What for? We got Death Dreads, we got Killer Cans. Why do we need some Hume Walker?" Grabbits turned to him with the kind of patience that mech boys reserved for explaining things to particularly dim boys. "Because this ain't just some Hume Walker. This is ancient Hume tech, quality stuff. Look at the armor, look at the weapon systems. They built this thing to last, and even after all this time, it's still working. Imagine what we could do if we got it proper operational." "Could we make it Orky?" another Ork asked, and there was genuine interest in the question. "Course we could make it Orky," Grabbits replied enthusiastically. "Paint it green, add more Dakar, maybe put a few more arms on it, put an Ork in it instead of the Hume. It'd be the best Death Dread ever." This suggestion met with general approval. The Orks began discussing, with their characteristic blend of enthusiasm and complete disregard for practical difficulties, how they might go about converting a Dreadnought into a proper Orky war machine. Inside his failing chassis, Thalric listened to them plan his desecration with a kind of numb detachment. They were going to gut his Dreadnought, strip it down, rebuild it in their crude image. And him? They'd dispose of. Him, he supposed. Remove his sarcophagus and probably study the organic remains inside with all the gentle curiosity of a child pulling the wings off an insect. He'd been ready to die in battle. That would have been honorable. But this was going to be slow, conscious. He'd be aware as they took him apart, as they ripped out the systems that had sustained him, as they ended his existence not in the glory of combat, but in the methodical dismantling of salvage. He found, to his surprise, that he was afraid. After 300 years of service, after facing death 1,000 times, after already dying once and being brought back, he was afraid. not of death itself, but of this death, alone, unmourned, ending not with a battle cry, but with the sound of orc tools tearing him apart. Warboss Grimtooth, who'd been listening to the discussion, finally made his decision. Right, we take it with us, load it on the ship, grab it, you and the other mechs get to work on it. I want to see this thing, stomping around in green paint, shooting proper orky daka within the month. Understood? Understood, boss, Grabbits replied happily. The orcs set about the task with their characteristic efficiency, which is to say, they did it loudly, messily, and with several minor explosions along the way. Chains were attached to Thalric's chassis. Heavy equipment, looted from various sources and repaired with enthusiasm if not skill, was brought in to lift him. He was dragged out of the bunker, his shutdown systems unable to resist, leaving deep gouges in the sand. They hauled him to their ships, massive ramshackle things that looked like they'd been built by someone who'd seen a spacecraft once, from a distance, and decided to recreate it using scrap metal and optimism. Thalric was loaded into a cargo bay that smelled of promethium, unwashed orc, and something that might have been burning rubber. The ships lifted off, their engines screaming protests that seemed to bother no one, and the world that had been Vandius Tertius, the world that had been Thalric's tomb for 5,000 years, fell away beneath them. The eternal war continues. In the cargo hold of the orc ship, surrounded by spare parts and sleeping Gretchen, ancient Thalric's consciousness began to fade. Not into death, not yet, but into a forced shutdown, his damaged systems finally giving up their attempt to remain active. His last coherent thought was a prayer. Not for rescue, he was beyond that. Not for vengeance, though he'd have welcomed it. But for peace. For an end to the service that had already lasted far too long. Whether that prayer would be answered, only time would tell. What happened next to ancient Thalric could go several ways, and each is a perfect illustration of the dark, chaotic nature of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Perhaps the mech boys did exactly what they planned, stripping down the Dreadnought, removing Thalric's sarcophagus, and installing an orc pilot in his place. In that case, Thalric's consciousness would end, his organic remains disposed of without ceremony, his existence concluded in a scrapyard rather than on a battlefield. The Dreadnought that had been his body for 5,000 years would live on, but utterly changed, converted into an orky mockery of what it had been. Or perhaps, in their tinkering, in their attempts to interface orc technology with Imperial systems, something would go wrong. A psychic feedback loop, a malfunction in the neural interface. Something that would allow Thalric's consciousness, weak and degraded but still present, to remain connected to his chassis, even after the orcs thought they'd disabled him. Trapped, aware, forced to watch through his own senses as greenskins used his body to wage war. A prison worse than any stasis, a hell of consciousness without control. Or, in the darkest timeline, the orcs might succeed too well, might repair the Dreadnought to full functionality, restore its systems, make it operational in ways it hadn't been for millennia. And Thalric, given the choice between death and service, might choose service even in this corrupted form, might fight for the orcs not because he wanted to, but because fighting was all he knew, all he'd ever known, and the alternative was the void. Or maybe, just maybe, the Imperium would come. Perhaps some chapter fleet, tracking orc movements, would engage this warband. Perhaps in the battle, sensors would detect Imperial technology signatures coming from one of the orc ships. Perhaps space marines would board, seeking to recover stolen gene seed or sacred artifacts, and would find ancient Thalric, would recognize one of their own, even encased in greenskin modifications, would recover him, bring him back to their fortress monastery, restore him properly. And if that happened, if Thalric was given the chance to tell his story, to explain what had become of the Crimson Castellans company that fought on Vandius Tertius 5,000 years ago, what would he say? Would he remember enough to matter? Would his mind, degraded by millennia and trauma, be able to provide useful information? Or would he be just another damaged relic, his knowledge as corrupted as his systems? The truth is, in the grim darkness of the far future, there are no happy endings, only various shades of grimdark. Thalric's story, whether it ended in the scrapyard, or on a battlefield, or in some other way entirely, is just one of countless similar stories playing out across the galaxy. Warriors who fight and die and sometimes refuse to stay dead, trapped in machines that extend their service long past any reasonable limit. Xenos who scavenge and loot, and create their own bizarre versions of technology they barely understand. Empires that span thousands of worlds, but can't keep track of their own forces, leading to soldiers being abandoned on forgotten battlefields. This is what the Warhammer 40,000 universe is about, at its core. The futility of it all. The endless grinding war that consumes everything. The cruel ironies that plague those who try to do their duty. The fact that even the mightiest warriors, the most honored heroes, can end up as nothing more than salvage for their enemies. And yet, there's something darkly compelling about it. The sheer audacity of Orks waking up an ancient dreadnought just to see what would happen. The desperate determination of a space marine who's already died once, refusing to surrender even in the face of impossible odds. The collision of two very different philosophies of war, the reverent Imperial approach to their war machines versus the enthusiastic Ork approach to making things go boom. It's tragic, it's absurd, it's grimly funny, and horrifyingly sad all at once. And it's absolutely, perfectly, quintessentially Warhammer 40,000. Reflections on deep-time stories like this, fictional as they are, invite us to think about what it means to exist across such vast spans of time. 5,000 years. What does that even mean? In our own reality, 5,000 years ago was the beginning of recorded history. The first cities were being built. Writing was being invented. The entire span of recognizable human civilization fits into that time frame. In Warhammer 40,000, 5,000 years is significant, but not unheard of. Space Marines routinely serve for centuries. Dreadnoughts serve for millennia. The Imperium itself is 10,000 years old, having endured from the time of the Horus heresy to the present 41st millennium. There are characters in the lore who have been alive for all of that time, who remember when the Emperor walked among his people, who fought in the Great Crusade. What does such age do to a being? How does a mind cope with watching the universe change around it while you remain, if not the same, then at least continuous? The Dreadnoughts are perhaps the perfect embodiment of this question. They are warriors from another age, kept functioning through technology and necessity, serving in a universe that has moved past them. And then to add insult to injury, to have one of these ancient warriors discovered, not by his own people, but by their enemies. To wake from stasis expecting rescue and finding instead that you've been looted. It's a perfect encapsulation of the Warhammer 40,000 setting's bleakness. There is no safety. There is no guarantee. You can do everything right, serve with honor and courage, and still end up forgotten on a dead world until Orks find you. But there's also something almost funny about it, in a dark way. The Orks don't understand the tragedy. They're not being deliberately cruel. They're just being Orks. They found something interesting and wanted to see how it worked. They woke up the Dreadnought not out of malice but out of curiosity and enthusiasm. The fact that doing so was deeply traumatic for the warrior inside didn't occur to them because Orks don't think that way. They don't do empathy, they just do action and consequences. It's the collision between these two worldviews that makes the scenario so compelling. The Imperium treats its dreadnoughts with reverence, as sacred vessels containing the souls of heroes. The Orks treat them as really interesting loot that probably has good bits inside. Both are valid perspectives from their own cultural standpoints. Neither is right or wrong in any absolute sense. They're just different. And when different cultures collide in Warhammer 40,000, the result is usually violence. The cyclical nature of war. What makes this story even more poignant is that it could happen again, right now, Across the galaxy of Warhammer 40,000, there are probably dozens of similar situations playing out. Dreadnoughts forgotten on abandoned battlefields, Xenos discovering Imperial technology, warriors waking from stasis to find themselves in impossible situations. The war never ends. That's the fundamental premise of the setting. There is no final victory, no ultimate peace, just endless conflict consuming everything. And in such a universe, stories like Ancient Thalric's are inevitable. Warriors will be forgotten, battles will be abandoned, technology will be lost and found and lost again. It's a cycle that's been playing out for 10,000 years and will continue for who knows how much longer. The Imperium fights. Its enemies fight back. Worlds are won and lost. Heroes rise and fall. And somewhere, in the aftermath of every conflict, there are remnants. Machines that still function. Warriors who still serve. Relics of battles whose purposes have been long forgotten. The Orks are particularly good at finding these remnants. It's what they do. They're scavengers, looters, constantly seeking the next big scrap and the next pile of interesting technology. They spread across the galaxy like a green tide, and wherever they go, they find the detritus of other species' wars and make it their own. And so the cycle continues. The Imperium loses a dreadnought on some forgotten world. 5,000 years later, Orks find it. They wake it up, fight it, maybe capture it, maybe destroy it, maybe convert it into something Orky. And somewhere else in the galaxy, right now, another space marine is being interred in another dreadnought. Another battle is ending with warriors being placed into stasis to await retrieval. Another chapter is having to make the decision to abandon a position, leaving behind their honored dead in the hope of recovering them later. And someday, millennia from now, those newly interred dreadnoughts might find themselves in exactly the same situation Ancient Thalric did. Waking up on a dead world to find the universe has moved on without them. The cycle begins anew. This is the grim darkness at the heart of Warhammer 40,000. Not just that war is hell, but that it's an eternal, cyclical hell from which there is no escape. The same stories play out over and over, with different names but the same essential beats. Warriors fight, warriors fall. Warriors are sometimes given a cursed form of immortality, and then they fight and fall again, forever. Final thoughts. The story of Orks finding an ancient dreadnought asleep for 5,000 years is, at its core, about collision. The collision between past and present, between imperial reverence and orcish enthusiasm, between the honored dead and those who don't understand honor. It's about what happens when carefully preserved history meets the chaotic present, when sacred relics become salvage, when warriors who should have been remembered forever are instead forgotten entirely. It's also about the fundamental arbitrariness of fate in the 41st millennium. Ancient Thalric did everything right. He served faithfully. He fought bravely. When he was mortally wounded, he accepted the honor of interment in a dreadnought. He continued to serve. And yet, through no fault of his own, through simple bad luck and the chaos of war, he ended up abandoned and forgotten 5,000 years of darkness, only to wake to an ending that would have been unthinkable to him when he first closed his eyes. Would it have been better if he'd never been woken? If the Orks had simply scrapped the dreadnought without activating it, ending his existence without his awareness? Or was there some value, however dark, in the awakening? In the knowledge that even 5,000 years later, even in the worst circumstances, he could still fight? These are questions without good answers. The Warhammer 40,000 universe doesn't do good answers. It does moral ambiguity and grimdark tragedy and occasional black comedy. It does stories that make you laugh and wince at the same time. And the story of an ancient dreadnought being discovered by enthusiastic orc mech boys who just want to see how the Humitech works. That's pure Warhammer 40,000 right there. So the next time you look at a Dreadnought model on a tabletop, or read about one in the lore, remember that there's a story behind it. A warrior who died and was brought back, who serves in a walking tomb, who might someday sleep for so long that when they wake, the entire galaxy has forgotten them. Remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, even the mightiest warriors can become nothing more than interesting salvage. And remember that somewhere out there, on a dead world you've never heard of, there might be another Dreadnought waiting, sleeping in stasis, dreaming mechanical dreams, waiting for retrieval that might never come. Or worse, waiting for retrieval that comes from entirely the wrong people. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And sometimes, there are orcs finding interesting things and deciding to wake them up just to see what happens. If you enjoyed this deep dive into this particular flavor of grim darkness, if you found yourself both amused and horrified by the image of orc mech boys enthusiastically poking at an ancient war machine, then consider subscribing to this channel. We explore the lore of Warhammer 40,000 in all its absurd, tragic, fascinating glory. From the mightiest Primarchs to the smallest Gretchen, from epic battles that span star systems to personal stories that span millennia, we cover it all. And if you have thoughts on what might have happened to ancient Thalric, if you've got your own theories about how his story might have ended, share them in the comments. The beauty of Warhammer 40,000 is that there's always room for more stories, more interpretations, more ways for the grim dark to manifest. Until next time, remember, in the 41st millennium, even the honored dead get no rest, and sometimes they get found by orcs, for the Emperor, for the Omnissiah, and for all those warriors still sleeping in the dark, waiting for an awakening that may never come, or worse, may come from entirely the wrong direction. May their service be remembered, may their sacrifice be honored, and may they never, ever be discovered by enthusiastic greenskins with too much curiosity and access to power tools. This has been QON40K. Thanks for listening.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.